A farmer returned to his childhood home. That night, 4 men came for what his dog discovered. EMTT Sloan hadn't set foot on his father's property in 30 years. Not since the day he'd left at 17 with nothing but $100 and a promise to himself to never look back. But a father's death has a way of pulling you back to places you swore you'd forgotten. On his first night in the abandoned, creaking house, his dog Cinder dug up something that would change everything. A rusted metal box, buried deep beneath the old corral post. A post his father had used to mark Emt's height every year, a ritual that had died along with their relationship. It was a place only someone who lived those memories would ever think to look. And before the sun could even think about rising, 4 men surrounded the property. They moved in the dark like ghosts, their purpose as clear as the cold steel they carried. Emmett realized, with a sudden chilling certainty, they'd been searching for what was in that box for years, for decades. What his father had hidden was worth more than land, more than money. It was a secret worth killing for. And now, it might cost Emmett Sloan everything to keep it that way. The dust rose in thin, lazy clouds as Emmett's boots hit the dirt path. Each step felt heavier than the last, a pilgrimage back to a life he'd fought to escape. He'd driven for 3 solid days, sleeping in the cab of his truck at lonely rest stops, putting off this moment for as long as he could. The property looked smaller than he remembered. Broken. The fence posts leaned at angles that suggested they'd given up years ago, surrendering to the relentless pull of time and neglect. Weeds, thick and triumphant, had claimed the fields where his father, Jonas Sloan, once worked from the first hint of dawn until the light failed completely. Cinder, his loyal black-coated companion, jumped down from the truck bed, his nose already working the air, deciphering the silent stories left on the wind. The dog moved in tight, anxious circles, the hackles on his back raised, a low, guttural rumble building in his chest. Emmett had seen that behavior before. It was tension without a clear source, an animal's sixth sense, picking up on things people missed. Vibrations in the ground. Scents carried for miles. Changes in the air pressure that meant a storm was coming. Or trouble. The house stood silent, a monument to decay. Paint peeled from the siding in long, curling strips, exposing the gray, weathered wood underneath. One shutter hung crooked, like a broken bone. The front door sat slightly ajar, warped in its frame from 30 years of unforgiving seasons. Emmet pushed it wider. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, a thick blanket of dust covered everything. Furniture, draped in yellowed sheets, looked like a gathering of ghosts. The table where his family once ate dinner stood waiting. The chairs were still pushed in, as if the people who sat there had just vanished. He dropped his bag on the floor. The sound echoed through the empty rooms, a lonely, hollow thud. Cinder slipped past him, his claws clicking on the wooden floorboards. He investigated every corner, every doorway, with the systematic, cautious approach of a trained scout. EMTT walked to the kitchen. He turned the faucet. The pipes groaned, then spat out brown, sludgy water before finally running clear. He filled a bowl for the dog and set it on the cracked linoleum floor. Through the grimy window, he could see the old corral. The post still stood, weathered and gray, but upright. A silent sentinel. His father had built that structure with his own 2 hands when Emmet was just 7 years old. He'd taught him how to hold a hammer, how to drive a nail straight and true. Every year on his birthday, they'd walk out there together. His father would pull out his worn pocket knife, measure Emmet's height against that one particular post, and carve a new line into the wood. Emmet could still remember the smell of the fresh-cut timber, the comforting weight of his father's hand on his shoulder. He hadn't thought about that ritual in decades. He'd pushed it down, buried it with all the other memories he'd spent half his life trying to forget, the good ones and the bad. But standing here now, looking out at that post, something pulled at him. An ache deep in his chest he couldn't name. Cinder barked. just once. A sharp, insistent sound that cut through the silence. The dog stood at the back door, his body rigid, staring out toward the corral. His muscles were tight beneath his dark coat, his tail low and still. This was not a friendly bark. This was a warning. When Emmett opened the door, Cinder bolted outside. He didn't run around the yard. He didn't chase a scent. He headed straight for that old post, the same post where all those childhood measurements were carved into the wood. The same post where the last line had been etched when Empt was 12, just before everything between him and his father had turned cold and silent. A silence that had lasted until the old man died alone in a sterile hospital bed 3 weeks ago. Emmett followed, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The evening light was fading, stretching their shadows long and skeletal across the ground. Cinder circled the post 3 times, a strange, ritualistic dance. Then he dropped his head low and began to dig, his paws tearing at the base of the post. Dirt flew backward between his legs. The dog worked with a frantic, single-minded focus, digging deeper and deeper with each powerful pass. Mt watched from several feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't know what had triggered this. The dog had never acted this way before. It was a controlled frenzy, as if he wasn't just digging, but searching for something specific. Something he knew was there. The hole grew wider, deeper. Cinder's front legs disappeared into the earth up to his shoulders. Then, just as suddenly as he started, he stopped. He backed out of the hole, sat down, and looked directly at Emmett. Those amber eyes seemed to hold a question, an urgent plea. Emmett knelt beside the hole. In the fading light, he could just make out the dull glint of something metallic. He reached in, his fingers closing around cold, rusted edges. It was a box, heavy, maybe a foot long and half as wide. He pulled it free and brushed away the loose, damp dirt. The metal had corroded in places, eaten through by years spent underground. There was no lock, just a simple latch so rusted that it broke apart in his hands when he applied pressure. The lid resisted, sealed shut by time and earth. Then, with a final grinding sound, it gave way. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, were items that made his breath catch in his throat. Photographs, but not ordinary ones. These had been deliberately, carefully burned around the edges. Faces remained partially visible, but key features were obscured by the black char marks. He could make out parts of clothing, suggestions of poses, fragments of forgotten backgrounds. Whoever these people were, someone had made sure they couldn't be easily identified from these images alone. It wasn't just damage. It was a message. Beneath the photographs lay other things. Locks of hair, each one tied with a thin piece of twine. Each bundle was labeled with a date, written on a small piece of paper that had somehow survived the damp. The dates went back more than 20 years. There were different colors of hair: auburn, black, gray, blonde. He counted 6 bundles in total. Trophies from a hunt he knew nothing about. A pocket watch sat at the bottom of the box. The glass face was cracked. The hands were frozen at 11:47. He turned it over. Initials had been scratched into the back, but they'd been deliberately, violently scored away, leaving only faint traces he couldn't possibly read in the dim light. There was also a small glass vial, empty now, but stained inside with the dark residue of something that had long since evaporated. And then he saw the letters. Torn fragments of paper, with words written in his father's familiar slanted handwriting. Witness, protect, never speak. They'll come. Empt sat back on his heels, the cold metal box resting on his thighs. None of this made any sense. His father had been a quiet man, a simple farmer who worked his land and kept to himself, a man who built fences and fixed engines. Why would he bury a collection of destroyed photographs, human hair, and cryptic notes beneath a fence post? Why hide evidence of... what, exactly? Cinder growled. It wasn't the low rumble from before. This was a real growl, deep and menacing, coming from low in his throat. The dog's attention had shifted away from the box. He was staring, laser-focused, toward the tree line at the far edge of the property. MTT looked up. Darkness had settled while he'd been lost in the box's contents. The house was a dark silhouette. He hadn't bothered turning on any lights when he arrived. Only the last faint traces of sunset remained, painting the western sky a bruised, angry purple. And then he saw it. Something moved in the shadows near the fence line. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't branches swaying. It was deliberate, human movement. Cinder's growl intensified. The hair along the dog's spine stood up straight and stiff. Emmett's hand instinctively went to his belt, to the knife he'd worn there since he was 15. It was still there, still sharp. He grabbed the box and stood up slowly. Whoever was out there had been watching him. They had been waiting, and they had seen him dig up the secret his father had taken to his grave. Emmet backed slowly toward the house, the box tucked tight under one arm, his eyes locked on the tree line. Cinder stayed close, a dark shadow pressed against his leg, positioning himself between Emmet and whatever threat moved in the darkness. The dog's training held. There was no barking now, just alert silence and coiled, ready tension. 3 years ago, Emmet had found him half-starved and beaten by the side of a highway. He'd spent months nursing him back to health, teaching him to track, to watch, to warn, without ever giving away their position. Those lessons were paying off now. Inside, Emmet set the box on the dusty kitchen table and moved through the house without turning on any lights. He knew this layout by heart. He knew where the floorboards creaked, which windows offered the best sight lines, how the back door always stuck unless you lifted it just right while pulling. It was muscle memory from a childhood spent hiding in these very rooms. He checked the front windows first. Nothing visible on that approach. The side of the house was clear, too. But at the back window, the one facing the corral, he saw them. 4 shapes, moving out of the trees. They were separated by maybe 20 yards each, forming a loose, disciplined perimeter around the property. They moved with a chilling purpose, not trying to hide anymore. They knew he'd seen them. Now they were just closing in. Emmett's pulse hammered in his ears, a frantic drum against the silence, but his hands stayed steady. Fear was fine. Fear kept you sharp. Panic was what got you killed. He'd learned that working with 1,000-pound cattle. They could sense hesitation, and they would exploit it without mercy. Men were no different. He reached up and pulled the old rifle from the cabinet above the door. His father's Winchester, .30-30. It probably hadn't been fired in a decade, but the old man had kept his tools clean. He worked the lever action. It was smooth, still functional. He found a half-empty box of ammunition in a drawer. He loaded 5 rounds into the magazine, the metallic click of each cartridge echoing in the dead air. A knock came at the front door. 3 deliberate, heavy strikes. Not a neighborly rap, a summons. Then a voice, calm and measured, cut through the night. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just want what you dug up." Emmett said nothing. He crouched low, the rifle ready. Cinder positioned himself at the base of the stairs, a silent guardian watching the door. The voice continued, patient, reasonable. "Your father took something that didn't belong to him. We've been looking for it a long, long time. You hand it over, we leave. Simple as that." "Who are you?" Emmett called back, his own voice tight. "That doesn't matter," the voice replied instantly. "What matters is that box. Did you look inside?" Emmett glanced at the table. The photographs with their burned edges, the bundles of hair with their cryptic dates, his father's desperate handwriting on those torn scraps of paper. "Yeah," he said, the word coming out like a stone. "I looked." There was a pause. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threats. When the voice came again, it was different. Harder. Colder. "Then you know this is bigger than you. Bigger than your father ever was. The smart thing to do is to give it up. Walk away. Forget you ever came back here." "And if I don't?" Emmett asked, his knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. Another pause. Longer this time. When the man spoke again, Emmett heard something that made his stomach clench into a cold, hard knot. It wasn't anger. It was resignation. The sound of a man who had already made peace with what was about to happen next. "Then we come in and we take it. And you don't walk away from anything. Ever." Emmett moved to the side of the window, staying in the shadows. He could see the speaker now. A man in dark clothing, standing just beyond the porch light's reach. He was broad-shouldered, maybe in his mid-40s. A thick, ugly scar was visible even in the weak light, running from his temple down to his jaw. The other three had emerged from their positions, tightening the circle. All of them were armed. All of them were watching the house with the unnerving patience of predators who know their prey is trapped. The scarred man raised his voice again. "You've got 5 minutes to decide. After that, we're coming through the door. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. It's your choice. But the ending is the same either way." MT looked at the box on the table. He looked at whatever terrible truth his father had died protecting. He looked at the evidence someone wanted erased so badly they would surround a house with armed men in the middle of nowhere. 5 minutes. 5 minutes to decide if that truth mattered more than his own life. MTT's mind raced, working through the grim options. Front and back doors were covered. The windows were too small to climb through quickly. It was 4 men against 1. They had the numbers, the position, and probably a hell of a lot more ammunition. Tactically, he was already beaten. But they didn't know the property like he did. They didn't know the house. And they didn't know what his father had built into this place during the long, lonely years when a quiet paranoia had slowly consumed him. He remembered it now. A memory from when he was 10 years old. He remembered his father spending weeks in the cellar, digging, expanding the old root cellar into something much bigger, much deeper. At the time, Emmett had thought his father was just preparing for bad weather. Tornadoes sometimes touched down in these parts. It made sense to have a safe space below ground. But the digging had continued long after any storm shelter needed that much space. His father had installed a heavy wooden door, reinforced with a deadbolt that only locked from the inside. The entrance was in the pantry, hidden beneath a worn-out rug and a cunningly designed sheet of plywood his father had made to look just like the regular flooring. You would never find it unless you knew exactly where to look. 3 minutes left. Maybe less. EMITT grabbed the box, tucked it back under his arm, and gave a low whistle. Cinder came immediately, pressing his body against Emmett's leg, a silent promise of support. Together, they moved into the dark pantry. Emmett pulled back the rug and lifted the plywood sheet. A ladder descended into absolute darkness. He'd need a light, but he couldn't risk it yet. He went down first, his boots finding the familiar wooden rungs. Cinder followed with careful, silent steps. The cellar smelled of damp earth and old timber. Emmett's feet hit the packed dirt floor. He felt his way along the wall, his fingers searching for the oil lamp his father had always kept down here. He found it, struck a match, and the flame caught, spreading a weak, flickering yellow light across the space. It was bigger than he remembered. The walls had been shored up with thick, heavy beams. Shelves lined one side, still holding jars of preserves that had gone bad decades ago. And in the back corner, partially hidden behind an old canvas tarp, was another opening. A tunnel. It was narrow, supported by rough-cut posts, and it extended into a darkness that swallowed the lamplight completely. It was his father's escape route. Or his tomb. Maybe both. Above them, he heard the sharp, violent crack of breaking wood. They had forced the front door. Heavy boots pounded on the floorboards, moving through the rooms, searching. Voices called out to each other, efficient and professional. These were not random thugs. They moved like men with training. Military, or maybe law enforcement. "Check everything. He's here somewhere," MTT quickly pulled the canvas tarp over the tunnel entrance, positioning himself behind it with the rifle ready. If they found the cellar entrance, they'd come down that ladder one by one. He'd have maybe one good shot before they returned fire. Not great odds, but better than being caught in the open upstairs. Cinder lay flat against the ground, utterly silent, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. The dog understood danger. He understood stillness. There were more sounds from above. Furniture being overturned, drawers being ripped out and emptied onto the floor. They were being thorough. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed the pantry floor, before someone found the hidden entrance. EMTT's finger rested lightly against the trigger guard. Not on the trigger itself. Not yet. His father had taught him that too. Don't commit until you're sure of the target. Don't fire unless you mean to hit something vital. A voice came from directly overhead. There's a rug in here. It doesn't sit right on the floor. The sound of plywood scraping against wood. Light from the kitchen spilled down into the cellar. A shadow blocked it. Someone was leaning over the opening, looking down. Empt raised the rifle, sighting along the barrel. His breathing slowed. Time itself seemed to stretch and thin. The scarred man's face appeared at the top of the ladder, his eyes adjusting to the lamplight below. There you are, he said. The scarred man held up one hand, palm forward. It was a gesture that could mean peace, or it could mean stop right where you are. Emmett kept the rifle aimed at the center of his chest. At this distance, even in the poor light, he wouldn't miss. Easy now, the man said. His voice carried no fear, just cold calculation. You pull that trigger. My men come down here shooting. You might get me, but you won't get all of us. And your dog dies too. Emmett's jaw tightened. The man was right. One shot, and then chaos. There was no way to reload fast enough, no way to protect Cinder in the crossfire. So we're at what you'd call an impasse, the scarred man continued. He started down the ladder slowly, deliberately, his boots finding each rung with care. He was testing Empt's nerve. You've got one bullet with my name on it. I've got 3 men upstairs who will burn this whole place to the ground if they have to. Neither of us wins that way. Then why are you coming down here? Empt asked, his voice steady. The man reached the bottom and stood with his hands visible, away from his body. He hadn't drawn a weapon. Because I'm hoping you're smarter than your father was. Jonas Sloan was a stubborn man. He died protecting something that was never his to protect in the first place. MTT felt something shift and break in his chest, hearing his father's name spoken by this dangerous stranger. You knew him? Not personally, the man said, taking a slow step forward. But I know what he did. I know what he saw, 23 years ago. Him and that friend of his, Vernon Hale. They collected evidence they should have left buried. Vernon Hale. The name meant something. It triggered a distant, foggy memory. An older man, his father's age, who used to visit the property sometimes when MTT was very young. They would sit on the porch and talk in low, serious voices while MT played in the yard. Then one day, Vernon just stopped coming. His father never explained why. Vernon talked before he died, the scarred man said, his eyes reading MT's expression perfectly. He told us about the box, told us Jonas buried it somewhere on this property. We've been searching for 5 years. Every time we thought we'd found it, we came up empty. Your father was a clever man. The corral post, Emmett said quietly. The corral post, the man confirmed with a nod. Where he marked your height every year. Sentimental, stupid, but effective. He paused, his gaze flicking to the box in Emmett's hand. You looked at what's inside. The photographs, the hair, the watch, the letters. It's evidence. Evidence of people who disappeared. People that very powerful men wanted gone for good. His voice hardened. Your father witnessed something he shouldn't have. Instead of walking away, He documented it. He kept proof. That proof puts names to crimes. It connects faces to bodies that were never, ever supposed to be found. Do you understand what I'm telling you? MT understood. His father hadn't just hidden a box. He had hidden testimony. He had hidden evidence that could destroy lives, end careers, and send powerful people to prison for the rest of their days. And someone, somewhere, had paid these men a lot of money to make sure that evidence never surfaced. "Who are you working for?" Emmett demanded. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that box comes with me tonight, one way or another." "And if I give it to you, you just let me walk away? Forget you were ever here?" The scarred man's silence answered louder than any words ever could. Emmet saw it in his eyes. It was the same cold resignation from earlier. They couldn't leave him alive. Not now that he'd seen what was in the box. Not now that he knew enough to ask the right questions. "Thought so," MT said. He fired. Not at the man. He fired a single shot into the ceiling, just above the scarred man's head. Wood splintered. Dust rained down. The man dove sideways, reacting on pure instinct. But Emmet was already moving. He grabbed the box, pulled back the canvas tarp, and shoved Cinder into the dark tunnel opening. He followed right behind him, the lamp in one hand, the rifle in the other. Behind him, there were shouts, boots pounding on the ladder. Someone was yelling to get around to the back of the house, to cut him off wherever that tunnel led. The earth smelled damp and close as Emmet crawled forward into the darkness his father had dug for him, decades ago. The tunnel was barely wide enough for Emmet's shoulders. Rough timber beams supported the walls and ceiling every few feet, preventing a collapse but making movements slow and awkward. He had to crawl on his hands and knees, pushing the box ahead of him, the rifle slung across his back by its worn leather strap. The oil lamp swung from his belt, casting wild, dancing shadows that played tricks on his eyes. Cinder moved just ahead, a low, dark shape, his paws finding sure footing on the packed earth. Behind him, voices echoed through the cellar. He could hear them at the tunnel entrance. Someone had entered, and he could hear them struggling with the tight space, cursing in the dark. Their size was working against them here. EMTT was lean from years of hard, physical work. He could compress himself through narrow gaps. But a bigger man would have trouble. That bought him a little time. Not much, but maybe enough. The tunnel began to angle upward after about 50 yards. His father had dug it to come out somewhere beyond the house, somewhere with cover. But where? EMT couldn't remember any strange mounds or depressions in the landscape from his childhood. His father would have disguised the exit, made it look perfectly natural. The air grew fresher. He could smell pine needles and the cool night air. He was close. Cinder had stopped just ahead, waiting patiently at what looked like a dead end. Emmet pushed past the dog and felt the barrier. It was wood. A hatch. He pressed upward. It was heavy, but it moved. Dirt and grass slid off as he lifted it. A sky full of brilliant, cold stars appeared overhead. He emerged into a thicket of wild brush about 100 yards from the house, right near the old, dilapidated equipment shed his father had used for storage. The placement was perfect. From the house, this spot was completely invisible, hidden by the shed. But from here, he could see the house. He could see the men. One stood guard at the back door. Another was circling around the side. That left 2 of them, probably including the scarred man, still in the tunnel, coming after him. Emmet pulled Cinder up out of the tunnel, closed the heavy hatch, and scattered brush over it. Then he moved in a low crouch toward the shed. Inside, he found what he had desperately hoped would be there. His father's old truck, covered by a heavy tarp, sitting up on cinder blocks. The keys were gone, probably lost to time years ago. But Emmet knew how to hotwire an ignition. He had learned that particular skill at 16 from a rebellious ranch hand who'd done time for Grand Theft Auto. It wasn't something he was proud of, but right now it was a skill that might just save his life. He worked fast, his fingers sure and steady. He stripped the steering column cover, found the right wires, and touched them together. Sparks flew. The engine turned over once, coughed, and died. He tried again. The battery was weak, but there was still some life in it. On the third attempt, the engine caught. It ran rough, sputtering and complaining, but it was running. He heard shouts from the house. They'd heard the engine. The man at the back door spun around, raising his weapon. EMT threw the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator. The vehicle lurched forward. The tires, which hadn't moved in years, spun uselessly for a second before finding traction. He kept his head low. The back window of the cab shattered, glass spraying everywhere. They were shooting. Cinder barked once, a sharp, angry sound, as he crouched on the passenger side floor, pure instinct taking over. MT aimed for the narrow gap between the shed and the fence line. The truck crashed through overgrown weeds, bouncing hard over the rough, uneven ground. Another shot rang out. The side mirror exploded into a spiderweb of cracks. He cranked the wheel hard, fishtailing onto what used to be the main access road. The headlights were weak and yellow, barely illuminating 10 feet ahead, but it was enough to see the path. In the rearview mirror, he saw movement. 2 of the men were running for a dark SUV parked near the tree line. They were going to follow him. Of course they were. This was far from over. But now he had the box. He had mobility. And he had 1,000 questions that needed answers. Questions about who his father really was, what he had witnessed, and why his best friend, Vernon Hale, had betrayed the only man who had ever trusted him with a life-or-death secret. The old truck's engine wheezed and complained as Empt pushed it harder and harder down the dark, rutted dirt road. Headlights appeared in the mirror. 2 sets of them, closing fast. Their vehicles were newer, faster, and much better maintained. They would catch up to him within minutes on an open road. He needed different terrain. He needed to level the advantage. Half a mile ahead, the road forked. The left fork led to the main highway, a long 15-mile stretch of straight pavement where speed would decide everything. A race he was guaranteed to lose. The right fork led up into the hills, onto a network of old, forgotten logging trails that hadn't been used in years. They were narrow paths with tight, winding turns, places where a lighter, more nimble vehicle could slip through gaps that would stop something heavier. Emmett yanked the wheel and took the right fork. The truck bounced violently over ruts and exposed tree roots. Thick branches scraped and screeched along the sides. Behind him, the headlights followed, but more cautiously now. They couldn't risk damaging their vehicles on this unknown, treacherous terrain in the dark. He made a risky decision. He killed his own headlights. He was driving blind, guided only by memory and the faint moonlight that filtered through the thick canopy of pines. He followed the pale strip of dirt that wound its way deeper into the woods. The truck protested every impact, the suspension groaning, but it held together. His father had always built things to last. Cinder lifted his head, his ears swiveling forward. The dog had sensed something. A moment later, Empt heard it too. The sound of moving water. It was the creek that ran through this part of the hills. It was narrow but deep, fed by mountain springs that never ran dry. The old wooden bridge that used to cross it had collapsed in a storm years ago. But he knew there was a ford about a quarter-mile downstream, a spot shallow enough to cross if you knew the precise path where the rocks made it passable. He found the spot and guided the truck down the steep embankment. Cold water rushed around the tires, threatening to pull them sideways. The engine sputtered but didn't stall. Halfway across the creek, he stopped. He cut the engine, grabbed the box and his rifle, and gave a low whistle for Cinder. They abandoned the truck right there, dark and silent in the middle of the ford. They waded to the far bank, the frigid water soaking them to the waist. Behind them, the headlights of the pursuing vehicles appeared at the top of the embankment. The SUV stopped. EMTT watched from behind the cover of a large fallen log. The scarred man emerged from the vehicle and studied the situation. He saw the abandoned truck, sitting dark and empty in the creek. He would know it was a decoy. He would know that Empt was on foot now. And being on foot meant he was slower. It meant he was trackable. The scarred man gestured to his men. They fanned out, preparing to cross the creek and begin the hunt. Empt turned and moved deeper into the trees. The advantage had just shifted, dramatically. They were the hunters now, and he was the prey. But these were his woods. These woods had taught him how to move quietly, how to read the terrain, how to survive. His father had taken him hunting in these very hills as a boy. He had taught him how to track a deer, how to anticipate its movements, how to understand the way an animal thinks when it is being pursued. Those same lessons worked on men too. He started to climb. The ridge above offered high ground and better visibility. From there, he could see their approach. He could choose when to move and when to hide. The box felt heavy in his arms. Those photographs, those locks of hair, those fragmented letters. It was evidence his father had protected for more than 2 decades. Evidence that these men would cross a cold creek in the dead of night to get their hands on and destroy. Empt thought about his father's last years. The isolation, the paranoia, the way he had pushed everyone away, including his only son. It hadn't been cruelty. It had been protection. Jonas Sloane had been carrying a terrible burden, a secret that made closeness a dangerous liability. He had built escape routes and hiding places because he had known, with absolute certainty, that someday someone would come looking for what he had. And when they did, he had wanted to make sure they would have to work for it. And now, Emmett finally understood. The decades of silence between them hadn't been rejection. It had been love. It was a father's desperate, silent attempt to keep his son safe from a truth that was too dangerous to share. Below him, the beams of powerful flashlights cut through the darkness. The hunt had begun. But Empt wasn't just running anymore. He was going to finish what his father had started. The 4 men moved through the forest with a cold, tactical precision, but they were making mistakes. Small ones, but mistakes nonetheless. A boot scraping loudly on a stone. A dry branch snapping under a careless weight. They were trained, but they weren't patient. They wanted this finished, and that impatience was going to cost them. Empt watched from his position high up on the ridge. He had taken what he needed from the box, the photographs, the letters, the watch, wrapped them carefully in the oilcloth, and tucked the bundle deep inside his jacket. Then he had placed the empty box itself in plain view on a flat rock, about 20 yards from his hiding spot. It was bait. They would see it, they would move toward it, and they would group together. And that's when he would act. The scarred man spotted it first. He raised a hand, and his men converged on his position. Emmett counted the seconds, his heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm. He waited until all 4 of them stood within 10 feet of each other, their attention completely focused on the box. Then he fired. Not at them. At the propane tank he had found 30 yards behind their position. It was an old camping cylinder someone had abandoned years ago, rusted and forgotten, nestled among the rocks. The bullet punched cleanly through the metal. Gas hissed out, invisible in the dark. The men spun around, weapons raised, searching frantically for him in the trees. Emmet fired a second round. The spark from the impact ignited the propane cloud. The explosion wasn't massive, but in the confined space between the dense trees, it was more than enough. Fire bloomed, a sudden, violent ball of orange and hot white light. The men scattered, disoriented, their night vision completely destroyed by the sudden, blinding flash. EMTT was already moving. He circled around behind them while they were still stunned, with Cinder moving low and silent as smoke beside him. They reached the creek in minutes. On the far side, Empt found what he had been hoping for, an old, abandoned ranger station. He forced the door. Inside, a dusty radio sat on a desk. It was an old model, but it looked functional. He keyed the transmitter. "This is an emergency. Shots fired and an explosion near the old Sloane property, off County Road 17. Multiple armed men on scene, requesting immediate law enforcement response." He repeated the message twice, then left the radio on, the microphone dangling. Then he moved again, putting as much distance as he could between himself and the station. The scarred man and his crew would hear that transmission. They would know the law was on its way. They would have to make a choice: keep hunting him and risk getting arrested, or cut their losses and disappear into the night. From a vantage point half a mile away, Emmett watched. He saw the beams of their flashlights converging back toward the creek. He saw their vehicles starting up, the headlights retreating back down the dark logging trail. They were leaving. It was the smart choice. Without the box, they had no proof he had found anything. It would be his word against theirs, if it ever came to that. And with law enforcement responding to a call about gunfire and explosions, they couldn't afford to be found anywhere near the area. Emmett waited until their lights had disappeared completely. Then he waited another hour, just to be sure. When he was certain they were gone, he started the long walk back toward the main road. Cinder walked beside him, finally relaxed, his tongue lolling out. The dog had earned his rest. They both had. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Emmett had reached a small 24-hour gas station off the highway. He used the payphone to call the county sheriff directly. He told them he had evidence related to a series of disappearances from 23 years ago. Evidence that named names and documented unspeakable crimes. He told them he would deliver it personally, but only to the sheriff himself, only in a public place, and only with witnesses present. They agreed. They had no choice. The details he gave them were too specific, the names he mentioned too powerful to ignore. 3 days later, MTT stood in the sheriff's office. The photographs and the fragmented letters were spread across a wide wooden desk. A stern-faced state investigator took notes while the sheriff examined each piece of the grim evidence. Names were spoken aloud, faces in the burned photographs were recognized, and cold cases were officially reopened. His father's testimony, preserved in a collection of objects and fragments of paper, finally began to speak the truths that had been buried for far too long. MT didn't return to the property. He sold it through a lawyer, never setting foot there again. There were too many ghosts. But he did keep one thing: the pocket watch. The one with the cracked glass face and the hands frozen forever at 11:47. It was a reminder of his father's quiet courage, of a silence that had protected him, of a terrible burden that had been carried alone so that a son could live free. He wound the watch once. He set it on his dresser and let it tick. The sound was steady, unbroken, like a heartbeat that simply refused to quit. If you enjoyed this story of courage, legacy, and the incredible lengths a father will go to protect his son, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the heartland, where honor and sacrifice collide in ways you never, ever expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories just like these. Your support means everything.